everyone, I'm Jamie. I am the experiential learning librarian for Fort Vancouver Libraries. This is Fort Vancouver Libraries Words and Pictures. This is the 5th year we've done this program and the 2nd year we've done it virtually. So thank you all for spending your Saturday morning with us. Christy Peterson is going to be moderating for us, and our speaker this morning is Andrew Durkin. So I'm going to turn it over to Christy.
All right. I'm really happy that you're all here. You are welcome. I don't know, Jamie, we didn't talk about this beforehand, but with this small of a group, it's totally fine to have people have their video on if they want to.
Yeah, that's fine. And then, we are recording though, so if you're not comfortable with that, yes, just be aware.
Yeah, that is true. And if you want to leave it off, but then if you have a question you want to pop it on, that's completely fine. The other thing is feel free to type in questions in the chat at any point. We don't have to wait till the end to answer questions. So if you have something you think of in the middle, go ahead and type it out. Or you can ask your, you can pop your video on to ask a question and then pop it back off if you want to do that as well. This morning we have Andrew from Yellowbike Press, which is an author services company, and I'm just going to turn it over to him to get things started.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Christy and Mary, for inviting me to be here. Just to kind of give a kind of broad background of how I ended up in this position. I am a writer and have been traditionally published. My first book was a nonfiction book about music that was published in 2014. I sort of got into actually almost kind of in a weird way because I got my agent through publishing pieces of that book in my blog online. So that's kind of an unconventional way to get into the traditional publishing industry, but I had experience with traditional publishing with that book. And then I started working as an editor for Inkwater Press, which was a small self-publishing company based in Portland. And I worked there for about 5 years. They sort of went out of business during the pandemic. And so I ended up starting Yellowbike, which is an author services company, which is technically a self-publishing assistance type company that authors would hire if they're interested in self-publishing their books. We do editing and design are kind of our main, the main work that we do. We also do a little bit of publicity. I guess I wanted to start, the goal with this discussion, I think, is to try to unpack a little bit about what self-publishing even is. So I think it's important maybe just to start with some general definitions. I guess to try and understand how self-publishing is different from traditional publishing, the way I tend to think of it is in terms of economics, basically. Obviously it costs money to produce a book. And so, the question is, who is paying for that? Within the traditional publishing industry, it's the publisher. So the publisher, generally the way they approach publishing, the language that is used is they're trying to acquire properties and they make an investment in a manuscript or in an author in the hopes of getting that book out and making their investment back down the road. Those costs can be, it can start with, what's called a guarantee, which is money that's paid to an author upfront, sort of like a upfront fee for the privilege of being able to publish that book. But then there are editing costs, which can come in kind of multiple layers of starting with kind of big picture issues in a manuscript. At the developmental edit level, gradually refining down more toward talking about the language and refining the language a little bit. line editing, copy editing, dealing with kind of, the nitty gritty of spelling and grammar and so forth. All those types of editing are, labor intensive. They require people with a lot of expertise, and they cost money. So that's a big chunk of the cost of producing the book. Another big chunk is the cost of designing the book, laying out the kind of words in a easily readable way, making sure the material choices about how a book is laid out make sense for the content and support the content. So that can be issues of font choice and spacing and the type of paper and the type of binding and the size of the book, the trim size. So all of that requires a certain level of expertise. And then, of course, the design of the cover, which, a good cover can really help a lot in whether someone is even going to try to pick up a book in the first place. So again, within the traditional publishing model, the publisher is paying for these design tasks. And then, of course, there's the last piece of the production process, which is actually printing the books. In traditional publishing, this has typically been with offset printing, which is kind of an older way of printing where you've got the big kind of metal plates and the words are arranged appropriately, and the ink is physically printed onto the paper. It allows for kind of more subtlety and in the past anyway, a higher kind of aesthetic quality in the printed book, but it's also more costly because you have to basically print books in bulk. So all those costs, the guarantee to the author, the editing costs, the design costs, the printing costs, in the traditional publishing model, that all of that is taken on by the publisher. And of course, not necessarily out of the goodness of their heart, although, there are good-hearted publishers, but it's more to invest in getting that book out into the world in the hopes of selling books, in hopes of making a return on that investment, and then ideally making some kind of profit in the long run. Within the self-publishing model, that's all kind of flipped on its head. I should say that in order for the publisher to make money from the books that they're selling, there's usually a contract with the author, negotiated with the author's agent, that determines how payments are allotted. So in the traditional publishing model, the author is essentially giving up some rights in their book, so that the publisher is the one who is getting the initial payment when the book is out in the marketplace, and then the publisher decides how much of that they are going to give to the author. This is royalties. That giving up of rights can involve other things like, exactly kind of what the content of the book is. Since the publisher is invested in selling books, they want to kind of determine what the product is that they're selling. So they may make certain aesthetic choices or calls about, how that book is put together, and the author may or may not have involvement in that. So that's another example of what I mean by giving up rights. I can give you an example actually from my own traditionally published book, which the title, the published form of it, the title was Decomposition, a Music Manifesto. And, I never in a million years would I ever use the word manifesto about anything that I write. So that was something that my editor decided needed to be on that book. And so that was an example of how, because I had signed up with that publisher, I had to give up the right to kind of determine what the subtitle of my book was. So again, in self-publishing, this whole model is kind of flipped on its head. So the author is the one who is investing in all the costs of putting the book together. The author can also benefit. If the book actually sells, then the author keeps more of that money for themselves, has kind of more, I think, direct reputational benefit. So that's a kind of general and quick breakdown of the difference between traditional and self-publishing. Before I go a little deeper into self-publishing in particular, I just want to kind of stress that this is also pretty complicated. Like, I mean, there are ways in which these categories overlap a little bit, and I don't mean to suggest, and I don't, you know, I think it's a misnomer, I think, when authors assume that in the traditional model, you know, because the publisher is taking on a lot of like important tasks, that somehow, like, once you sign with a traditional publisher, it's necessarily easier or less work. I think particularly once the book kind of gets out in the world, most traditional publishers will expect the author to do a lot of the work of promoting it, of you know, finding readers. So, you know, these categories can be a little bit muddled. So I think I want to point out that, you know, self-publishing has been around for a long time. I mean, self-publishing existed really before traditional publishing existed. But it's definitely seen kind of a surge in the last 20 years or so. I mean, it's definitely become a lot more, a bigger chunk of the book industry as a whole. And I mean, I think one statistic I saw was but from Bowker, which is the company that puts out ISBNs, which are the numbers that are used to track published books. I think the statistic I saw was in 2019, the number of self-published books in that year alone was 1.7 million in the United States. And that itself represents a kind of a big increase from previous years. I think, again, the statistic I remember was before, like, in the 5-year period leading up to 2019, the growth in the self-published market in the US was something like 250%. So there's a lot of people doing this now. I think, you know, if you're considering self-publishing yourself, I think it's worth thinking about, you know, why it's so popular. What are the mechanisms that are kind of making it this way? I mean, there's a bunch of them. Some of them are, you know, things that we kind of like take for granted now that have changed about writing significantly in the last few decades. Certainly, you know, word processing in its various forms, whether just something as basic as Pages or Word, or something more sophisticated like Scrivener, allow for a lot more control and efficiency in writing, and allow for, you know, the ability to manipulate a text easily. If you have substitute a name for a character at the last minute, and you don't need to reprint the entire manuscript or get white out and change it in each instance. It's instantaneous, pretty much. And then there are all the kind of AI tools that make it easier to kind of refine a book, you know, just like basic spell check, but also things like Grammarly, or I think one software platform is called Pro Writing Aid, and it will do things like, you know, seek out and point out and analyze, you know, examples of, you know, passive voice, or redundancies, or excessive use of, you know, helping verbs. So all, you know, all of these things kind of, I would never say writing is easy, but all of these new tools make writing certainly more efficient. And so, like, there are people in the self-publishing industry who are putting out 3 or 4 books a year. And I don't think that would be possible without all of these tools. Another big development that has affected the growth of self-publishing is the arrival of more sophisticated print-on-demand technologies. You know, I mentioned before how traditional publishers use offset publishing, which is kind of like the the older, more traditional way of publishing books. Print on demand uses laser printing technology and does it in a way that combines it with the capacity to bind a book like that, so that it holds together like a book should. But the technology has evolved there was a point probably 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, where print on demand really looked noticeably different from offset, and to some extent that's still true, but print on demand is getting better all the time, and so it's getting harder and harder to see the difference between those two options. And print on demand is a lot cheaper, because what print on demand means is that you don't have to print in bulk. You don't have to print thousands of books up front. You only print them as you need them. The books aren't actually made until somebody buys them online, or until the author decides they want a batch of 10 or 20 to sell to at a trade show or something. And so that's a lot more cost effective for the author. There's not as much of a huge investment in printing up front. The nice thing about the print on demand companies, particularly the ones that I recommend, are Amazon KDP and Ingram Spark, and they're both, not only do they do the printing, but they're each connected to a marketplace. I mean, Amazon's directly connected to the Amazon marketplace, of course, and Ingram Spark has its own kind of distribution network of retailers and libraries and so on. I think there's something like 40,000 potential places that your book could end up through Ingram Spark. So all that kind of makes it a lot easier for a self-publisher to get their book actually printed. I think to some extent, probably the arrival of ebooks had a big kind of motivational effect on the self-publishing industry, because you don't even have to worry about that kind of endpoint of actually getting the physical books printed. I think, of course, the internet has been a huge boon to self-publishing in the sense that it's very easy to kind of tap into a network of other self-published authors. There's a thriving community out there of people who are doing this and sharing what they're learning through podcasts or YouTube channels or Facebook groups. There are organizations that, like the Alliance of Independent Authors, ALLI, which are basically like watchdog organizations to kind of rate and evaluate companies like mine that offer services to authors who are interested in self-publishing. So there's definitely kind of more of a sense of a community, and that definitely helps authors who maybe get the idea to self-publish but aren't really sure how to go about it. I think it gives them a little bit more confidence and more comfort. I would also say that because we are an increasingly networked society, it's much easier for authors to build their own audience. I think before we were all online, before we were all on our phones all the time, it was much harder for an author who was self-published to build a mailing list or to find readers. I think any of us who use social media or any other online technology are already pretty well versed in the kinds of things that you have to do to build an audience, and so that falls right into the self-publishing field pretty nicely. And then I guess the last thing I would say about why self-publishing is going through a kind of strong growth period is just maybe as a reaction to what's happening in traditional publishing. I think the trend within traditional publishing is just like in the trend in a lot of other content industries is toward increasing globalization, increasing consolidation. I think we're in the process of moving from the big 5 publishers to the big 4 publishers. So these are kind of bigger and bigger corporate entities. And in part, that means that there's more kind of on the line for them when they publish a book, and there's more, it's already kind of a risk averse industry. And I think that this, the direction that the corporate structure in traditional publishing is evolving, makes it even more risk averse. And I think all that kind of compounds what were already some pretty rigorous and, maybe esoteric gatekeeping layers that you have to go through to even kind of get into the traditional publishing industry. I mean, I've been sort of mentioning the idea of having an agent. I mean, that's kind of like the protocol. If you are trying to get published with a traditional publisher, you need to have an agent to represent you and to do that kind of negotiation with an editor. And then the editor has to have a conversation with their board and make sure that there's a budget for publishing that book. So there's, all of the kind of built-in inaccessibility of the traditional publishing industry, I think, is just exacerbated by these trends toward, consolidation in these behemoth publishers. And I think a lot of authors are, even if they might not necessarily, perhaps they flirt with the idea of trying to go through a submission process, but I think more and more authors are choosing not even to bother and to start trying to kind of move toward self-publishing, as a choice and not as a second option. So I think in that vein, I think I would suggest that as complicated and as busy as this field is right now, I would say that this is a great time to be writing books. With as much as is going on, it's a really exciting time to be writing books. I think there's a lot of potential for how things could evolve, and I think a lot of that is within the kind of self-publishing space. I think we're kind of working against certain perceptions of what self-publishing is and has been in the past, and a number of those perceptions, I think, are rooted in some degree of truth, but a lot of them are maybe not necessarily. But I mean, just to kind of give you the stereotype of what I think people have thought self-publishing to be. In the past, I think self-publishing was assumed to be a space for also rans, or people who were not, quote unquote, good enough to get into the traditional publishing industry. And I think, all of this is informed by, the complexity of the author's psyche. And I say this as an author myself, but, for myself and for most of the authors that I've ever worked with, I've kind of noticed this pattern where we have, on the one hand, it takes a strong ego to write a book. Frankly, it takes a lot of confidence in yourself, because it may be a project that you spend years on. It is, you may be writing 80, 90, 100,000 word book that you then are asking other people to give up hours of their lives to experience, or maybe days of their lives to experience. And so that takes a certain degree of self-confidence, self-assurance, chutzpah, however you want to put it. The flip side is that authors are also, and again, I speak as, from this experience myself, are also very insecure. And so I think, in the past, this kind of dialogue between traditional and self-publishing was informed by this sense that, if you get accepted by a traditional publisher, you're getting a certain kind of approval within the publishing world. I mean, I can say for sure, having experienced that once, that it feels good to know that some company is willing to invest in your work and to put their name on your work. So I think I think to some extent, the perception of self-publishing in the past has been informed by the fact that you're not really getting that same kind of like external literary legitimacy by self-publishing. You're essentially relying on yourself. You believe that this is a good work. You believe this is something that an audience would be interested in. So, I'll talk more about that in a second, but I just wanted to sort of throw that in there as part of like how, what self-publishing, what its reputation has been in the past. I think in the past, we've tended to be thought of as a space for amateur work. I think in the past, it's thought of as being like a path that required more work than traditional publishing. And as I was trying to hint at before, having experienced both sides, I would say they involve an equal amount of work. In the past, I think the perception was that self-publishing was a path that yielded maybe less reward, whether financially or reputationally. And I think probably most tellingly in the past, self-publishing was probably a space where, there was a lot of opportunities for scams and shady business practices and unethical companies. And this goes back again to like the author psyche question. I think there have been a lot of companies within the self-publishing space in the past that have tried to take advantage of authors' insecurities and to say that, we will help you get a bestseller, or we will, I think probably taking advantage of the option or the possibility of seeing your name in print. So, I think that's kind of what we're kind of working from. But in 2021, a lot of that is changing, and a lot of it has already changed. I think more and more authors are seeing that self-publishing offers a space where you can control your own work. I could have decided what subtitle I wanted to put on my book. I think a lot of authors are potentially seeing it as a space where you might have a little more room to kind of develop your own voice, to tell maybe more diverse stories. As an editor, I had the good fortune a couple of years ago of working with Keisha Fisher, whose book of short stories went on to win the Oregon Book Award. And I often wonder, I never actually asked her about this, but I mean, that was self-published. And I mean, the book itself is somewhat heavy. And I kind of wonder, what she would have faced if she had chosen to pursue traditional publishing, what kinds of changes they would have wanted to make to that work. I certainly, and as an editor myself, I offered her feedback on the content of the book, but I tried to preserve, what made that book special. And I think, there's a risk, I think, within the traditional publishing model that especially if you're dealing with content that, is not tried and true or doesn't fit a formula, there's a risk of having that kind of watered down or taken out. So I think more authors are starting to recognize that and wanting to be kind of simultaneously wanting to strengthen their work as they can, but wanting to stay true to their voices or their stories. I think a lot of authors are recognizing how much more supple and responsive self-publishing can be. I mean, one of the big complaints authors have about traditional publishing is how slow it moves. I talk about like human time and geologic time and traditional publishing time, and traditional publishing time is definitely it feels the slowest, and it's not adaptable. I mean, as a self-publisher, you can put out a book and decide maybe a few weeks in that you want to change something about the cover, or maybe there's a chapter that you finally made a decision about, like how you were addressing some issue in the story. you could do that. I mean, you can republish the same book fairly easily. That is not really possible within the traditional publishing model. You'd have to kind of go through the whole process of having another edition, and depending on what your contract was with that publisher, that might not be something you could do for a while or maybe ever. So I think that, you know, to go back to what I was saying before about like the craving for the craving that we all have for literary legitimacy as authors, I think that within self-publishing, I think what's exciting is that there is the possibility of new kinds of literary legitimacy, so that you are finding your people for your book, for your type of story, as opposed to trying to kind of fit your book into kind of a predetermined audience, which is, I think, to some extent what happens within a lot of traditional publishing paradigms. I think the last thing I would point out about just what's exciting about publishing right now, and particularly self-publishing, is that there seems to be this movement towards almost like a hybrid version of the industry that includes both traditional publishing and self-publishing sometimes in the same space. So I know, for example, Barnes & Noble is probably one of the best known book retailers, and very highly associated, I think, with traditionally published books, the most front list stuff. But Barnes & Noble now has a self-publishing division. Simon & Schuster, I think, has a self-publishing division, Archway Press. And then from the other side, within the self-publishing world, there are companies like Reedsy, for example, where you can hire a freelance editor or a freelance designer to help you on your book. And these are all people who are in some ways the freelancers that Reedsy focuses on anyway tend to be refugees from the traditional publishing industry. I mean, they've all kind of worked there. Some of them still are. I don't always know kind of what what mechanisms kind of led them to also be doing this freelance work, whether that's a financial thing on their part, or just they want to work with more authors. But in any case, it's an example of how like some of the standards of the traditional publishing industry in terms of aesthetics are starting to kind of overlap into self-publishing and becoming available to authors. Okay, so I guess there's just another little chunk I want to get into here, and then if anyone has questions, I'm happy to kind of talk about, specific questions you might have about your own work or authors who might be interested in self-publishing. I think there's a couple things that I would want to kind of let people know for whoever is interested in self-publishing. I think these are kind of important things to know, and things I've noticed over the last few years that I wish some of my authors had known going into it. And one of the big ones is that, book production itself, the actual making of the book, once you've written your manuscript, and everything that I was describing before, the steps that you have to take to actually get the book in print, the editing, the design, the printing, is a lot easier than you think. In other words, I think I've worked with authors who feel maybe a little overwhelmed at how that process is going to unfold, and I think are pleasantly surprised at how doable it is. I mean, yes, it costs money. Yes, it takes time, but it's not as mysterious as it might seem for anyone who's never published a book before. And there are a lot of processes in book publishing that, if you've never gone through them before, might seem strange or confusing at first. But that part of it is for most people, is going to turn out to be easier than they expected. I think what's much harder, and this is kind of the thing that I would prep anyone getting into self-publishing for, is finding an audience, is selling books, is promoting your book. That's kind of where there's a lot less, it's a lot less cut and dry. There's room for experimentation and creativity in that part of it, but it's not. That takes a lot of work. That takes a lot of, it's labor intensive. But the nice thing is that it's labor intensive regardless of whether you're in self-publishing or traditional publishing. So I think that, that you should see that as a positive thing if you're exploring self-publishing as an option. The other thing to keep in mind is that because of all of the developments in self-publishing in particular over the last few years, I mean, I have a whiteboard with a list of websites and people who are kind of active in the field and new technologies and new software that I'm still kind of figuring out what each one of these things is. You hear these names, you hear these terms, and you're trying to get the lay of the land. And so there's a lot to take in. It's complicated. It can feel overwhelming, and the possibility of burnout is real. So my suggestion always with new authors is that, to pace yourself. Nobody can get their mind around this world, maybe ever, but certainly not like with a first book. Even the people who present as experts in this field, this is a refrain of what they discuss. They're frequently saying, that this is, I don't know everything about what's happening in self-publishing now, but here's what I do know. Here's what I found out as I've gone along. So know that going in, and I think you'll save yourself a lot of stress because everybody's experiencing the same thing. So I think that's important to know. I think also in one thing I try to stress to authors who are doing this is that, ultimately the author is in control. The author is calling the shots. The author is deciding what the book is going to be. The role of a company like mine, which does author services, we do editing and design. We'll always kind of give our best advice about how to make a book stronger. I mean, the phrase I usually say to my authors is, if this was my book, here's what I would do. It's important that authors understand that just because they're hiring someone who has some degree of expertise in these tasks, that doesn't mean that they're not kind of involved in making that choice. That's actually what self-publishing is. Like they still are making the final call about what the book is going to be. I mean, the best professionals in the self-publishing industry are going to be invested in the success of your book. They want your book to do well and to achieve whatever your goals you have set out for it, and whether that's selling books or whether that's finding a certain type of audience. So they'll be responsive to that. But ultimately, that's the choices about all the forks in the road along the way as you're putting the book together. Those are all going to be ultimately up to the author. I'd say that kind of just really quickly, a few things to say about editing and design. I mean, within the editing framework, one thing I try to help authors do is to write like a reader. Basically write with an understanding that someone else who's not in your head is going to be reading this book, and that's like a refrain of a lot of my editorial feedback, is trying to get authors to see their work more in a fresher way, and in a way that is not kind of like caught up in the bias of having worked on the book themselves for so long. Within the design framework, my main piece of advice would be to be perceptive about, what other books like yours look like, in terms of cover art, in terms of font choices, in terms of the size of the book. And one regular practice in traditional publishing is design comps. So when books are put together and designers start working on them, that's the first thing they do is go to the bookstore or browse through Amazon to see other books in a similar vein. Not that they want to copy what the book looks like, but they want to have some idea about what other people are purchasing for books that tell a similar story or have a similar type of argument. In terms of promotion, I know there's some workshops on promotion tomorrow, so I won't say too much about this, but one thing that I find as a kind of a repeated idea that's been very helpful is, start small and build out. Don't expect to start kind of nationally with your promotion. Start by building relationships with libraries, with bookstores, with other writers. And, in a way, it's very helpful to kind of treat anybody who might be reading your book as you would treat a friend, like how that you're asking them to, to give up something to experience your book. You're asking them for their time, essentially. So anyone who's kind of involved in that process, it's important to, I think it's important to recognize that. I guess, I'll wrap it up here, but I guess the last thing I would say is to understand that if you are getting into self-publishing, that it's a long-term investment. Think of it as something that you will do over time. It's not a matter of necessarily focusing on one book and necessarily just assuming that, what's going to happen with that book is going to happen within the 3 or 4 month period around which that book is released. It's more like, I've heard stories of self-published authors who don't really sell many books at all until 3 or 4 years later because of something they did in the interim. There's some connection they made, or they're just persistent about it. And I think, it's not, I hate this term. I've heard this term authorpreneur, and I kind of not a fan of that term, but I get what it's suggesting. And I think, the idea of it is good. It just is essentially treating your work like you would treat a business, like it's something that you want to be doing more of. So how do you ensure that that's going to continue happening? And so it's a long-term investment of time. It's not something that happens instantaneously, and it requires patience, requires a little bit of experimentation, being willing to try out different things with trying to reach authors. But it can be done, and I think it can be done more and more. And I think, if it's something that you're interested in, if it's something you're interested in, this is a really exciting time to be getting into this area of publishing. So I'll shut up now. I've been rambling. I'm happy to
You're fine.
questions, but,
so we have one question that came in, and I think we can probably chat about this for a minute, about advice regarding children's books. This person, it's Deb. Hi, Deb. Was particularly interested in middle grade and young adult, but yay.
Hello.
But then Jocelyn also asked, I know Jocelyn has a picture book, and so it'd be interesting to talk about, especially from the self-publishing angle, because maybe not so much YA, but definitely middle grade, and for sure picture books. They're a little bit of a different animal when it comes to self-publishing. There's especially with picture books, there's more barrier because you're also needing an illustrator, and sometimes you're not an illustrator. So if you could just speak to self-publishing as it relates to the kids market a little bit, that would be fabulous.
Yeah, I would agree that picture books in particular that's its own entity, and yet it's very popular. We've my company has been around since May, and I think we've already had 4 or 5 at least inquiries about people who are working on picture books, and we're in the process of finishing one of those right now. I think the thing about picture books is that it's very competitive. Again, there's a lot of people publishing picture books, and I think that the the missing piece is the illustrator. A well-written picture book with bad illustrations is a problem. Like you want to have both kind of working together, and this is something that Christy has talked about before, but it's really kind of a marriage of the two, and that's it's really a collaborative thing, so it's helpful, I think, in finding an illustrator to be selective and find someone who is kind of responsive to your project in a way that they would take feedback and also make suggestions about how that book could be developed. I think with the one project that's about to be finished, we had a lot of back and forth in the editing phase about what the arc of the story was. I think we worked in significant ways on like the concept of the book. And I can imagine situations where the illustrator would also be involved, even like at that earlier phase. It just kind of depends on what your own comfort level is with that, and where you find your illustrator. With other children's books, I mean, I also write children's books, and so I think the challenge that I've had is that I think children's books in particular are a space where within the traditional publishing industry there are a lot of formulas. There's a lot of kind of data about what types of books sell, and I think that there's a lot of like desire to kind of replicate that same story or that same group of stories, which that's fine. Like there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But I think what's exciting within self-publishing is that you're not quite as locked into those choices, it feels like. So, I working with an editor can certainly like help you kind of refine the story that you want to tell. But I think that because in the self-publishing world, the editor is not necessarily going to be they're going to be invested in the success of your work, but they're not going to have as much on the line as a publisher would, a publisher who's like hiring editors to work on your book. So there's a little more freedom, is the point that I'm trying to make about actually writing the book and telling the story that you want to tell. I don't know statistically, I know like we typically see, in my experience with self-publishing, the kinds of books that we tend to see are lots and lots of picture books, usually, by a family member writing for a child, which is a great thing to do. But it's very common. It's one of the standard submissions that we've gotten in the past. A lot of like self-help books, nonfiction self-help is like very, very popular. And then I'd say probably the third category under that would be some type of like fantasy. We had a lot of submissions of fantasy novels, some portion of which were kids fantasy. So, it helps to know kind of going in, like what you're up against in terms of the market, what other authors are writing, and how many other books in this genre are out there if you published it tomorrow. I don't know, did I answer the question or? Oh, I can't hear you, Christy. Yeah, I'm still not hearing you. I'm not sure.
There we go.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I am my hearing.
Well, I was just thinking. I was going to ask Deb if that. I don't know if that covered what you were getting at as far as what your question is for young adults and middle grade. I know I am cheating a little because I know Deb, and I know that at one point she was working on a middle grade book, and so I suspect that partly it's about that. But I'll let you.
I have a middle grade trilogy that I'm going to start self-publish next year. And the problem is with COVID restricting school visits and in-person visits, where you have to, which is where you are able to market novels for children better. It's difficult because online you cannot market to the kids. You have to market to the adults, the parents and teachers and grandchildren or grandparents of children.
Yeah.
So I just wondered if you had any advice on that, you know,
promoting your book in the time of COVID. Yeah, that's a big challenge. I think I mean, I guess a lot will be determined by how things go this year with that, in terms of, you know, if we ever kind of get past the kinds of restrictions we have now and are, you know, there is more opportunity for school visits. It's something I certainly ran. I mean, we had one, this wasn't a kid's book, but one book that was a novella, and by an author who was asking for help in promoting it. And, you know, I must have spent about a month just like trying to find, and he's in Canada where things are a little better. But I spent a good month trying to find a bookstore or a library or somewhere where he could give just a reading, like not even like expecting them to carry the book or anything, but just like an opportunity for him to just read some of his work and possibly do like a kind of a launch event. And I had no luck with that. So I ended up spending a lot of my energy on, you know, trying to find blurbs for him, basically trying to find ways to kind of build up his reputation as an author. And he was a first-time author, so he'd never been through this experience before. But I essentially just kind of found a lot of, you know, he's an older author. He was 84. And so I found kind of other authors kind of, you know, who are publishing their first book kind of later in life. I found other authors in the Vancouver area. That's where he's based, up in Canada. Tried to find like other authors who were kind of had some kind of possible connection to the work he was doing. And just said, hey, you know, would you be interested in reading this and maybe saying a word or two about it that we could include on his Amazon page or on a website or in a press kit? And, you know, none of that, like, we also got some other like more like official reviews, but like none of that like blurb activity necessarily is translating into book sales directly. I mean, those, we sent them PDFs of the book to review. But they all those things are kind of building toward a later point where hopefully we could do a reading, and by that point we will have like created this this reputation. This reputation building is essentially what, you know, the task was at that point. So I don't have a good answer to the question of how to get around, you know, restrictions with presenting in schools, in particular with kids' books. But you know, I mean, depending on the age of the kid, if you're talking like middle grade, you know, a lot of kids are online. A lot of, you know, I don't know if you have a website or an online presence in other ways, but I mean, all of that can, if you work on that now and trying to build up, you know, your identity basically as an author and your brand in a way, as an author, as preparation for that time later on, hopefully when we can all be in a space together again to do this sort of thing. I think that would be time well spent.
Thank you.
So I want to jump in. We're running out of time, but we have two other questions. One person, Kelsey, asked, have you seen a difference in what types of books are published by traditional versus self-publishing routes as the industry has shifted? So maybe in genre or diversity or that kind of thing. And then there's one more after that, but I'll let you answer that one first.
Yes, I would say the answer is yes. I have seen a shift, and this is all like anecdotal related to me in particular in my own work. but the authors that I've seen more and more kind of exciting, interesting. Again, I mentioned Keisha's project before. I feel like I've seen more of that as I've gone along, and I know that the traditional publishing is at least in I don't know how to say this. I mean, in terms of like how they present to the outside world, they're trying to like make people aware that they are aware of like issues with diversity, and they're aware of trying to tell more stories that represent a kind of wider swath of the population and experience. But I struggle to find them. I don't think it's quite as common. And I think part of that just may be because, again, the traditional publishing industry moves slower, and it, there's more pressure kind of from the top. There's less kind of responsiveness to new trends, and so I would expect to see more of that within self-publishing, and just in my own experience, I feel like I have.
And then the other question, and I'll expand this out. I mean, they're asking specifically about Yellow Bike, but I would say they say, what would you expect an author to have done before they approach your company for your services? And I would expand that out to say, anybody who's seeking out any outside help with like design, editing, anything like that, like what should you have done yourself before you approach those companies to probably ultimately to get the best value for the money that you're going to spend?
Yeah, I would say, I think I mentioned earlier how there's a thriving community online of self-published authors. There's a lot of information available, both about writing itself and about like the mechanisms of publishing. There's a lot you can do before you ever have to hire somebody to edit a book. I always recommend hiring an outsider to edit the book because there are things you just won't see if it's your own work. I always recommend hiring a professional designer, especially a cover designer, because of the work that the cover does to actually sell the book. But even before you do either of those things, there's a ton of there's just so much information online in libraries. People are writing books about writing. I mean, there's a whole like growth industry of workshops like this, or people offering courses, people writing books, people having podcasts where if you dive in, you can learn a lot, and you can get your work into as strong of this what you want. By the time you're paying money to somebody to help you, you want to have invested a lot of time to make that work as good as it can be, so that you get the most value. Because if I'm like correcting missing punctuation, or if I'm working on like basic like formatting issues, stuff that you could easily kind of do on your own, then that's taking time and energy from just my edit, where I'm going to miss other things that are probably more important. So I would say, like, try as much as possible to front load that work before you ever get around to seeking out a company like mine. But also know that, like, we're always happy to kind of look at whatever you're working on and to give you a sense of where you're at in the process. So, I mean, we do sample edits all the time where authors who are not sure kind of how far along they are, how much more work they need to do, just get kind of some quick feedback from us and maybe some direction that they can pursue to refine their work further, and then come back later on. I don't know if that makes sense.
All right, we're just about up to time, but does anybody have any last minute things they're just dying to know before we're done? I posted the link for the book sales for the festival. And then I did mention this to a couple people, but we have a marketing workshop and panel tomorrow that will specifically address marketing. I know that for one of my folks that's going to be in the panel tomorrow is self-published and has done a lot of marketing work on his own. So he will have some ideas about that if you're interested in that. And yeah, thanks everybody for coming. and hope to see you at some of the other sessions. And we're really glad you started us off today.
Thank you all. Have a good day. Good luck, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.